We're back, baby. Today I'm talking about how I avoided getting my soul sucked out by a monster last night. Real thrilling stuff. If you haven't heard from me before, you should start on Reddit, because I really don't want to explain what's happened in my city all over again. If you read my previous story, welcome back. Please accept an affectionate headbutt lovingly sent across the internet from Mr. Bailey as a thank you. So last night I went grocery shopping. What that means these days is break into a grocery store, a restaurant, or the kitchen of an abandoned house late at night, fill up my duffel with any unexpired food they have, and book it out of there before anything discovers me. Not to brag, but I've gotten pretty good at it. And man, I cannot be grateful enough for the fact that at least microwaves and ovens still work. Because if I couldn't heat up soup or frozen chicken nuggets, I'd be dead by now. Grocery trips are still vastly limited by what hasn't expired in 9 months, but you'd be surprised what can stay in okay condition as long as refrigeration still works. Another blessing. Here's the thing though. Grocery shopping can be real dangerous, and I don't just mean the keeping an eye out for monsters all the time part. Like, yeah, that's an issue, but it's an issue everywhere. What makes grocery shopping particularly dangerous is the way Ashleys hunt. Not all monsters just run at you screaming and ready to use brute strength to tear you apart after all. Not every monster is like the Caleb I described before. Some are a lot smarter than we'd like to think, and their tactics have a lot more finesse. That's both good and bad. Good, because it means they obey certain rules and follow specific patterns, so if you know what not to do, they won't hurt you. Bad, because it was real hard early on to realize what those patterns were. Lots of people died falling victim to their traps, I'm sure. As for me, I figured out their strategy, but that doesn't mean they stopped trying. Take last night. I was in a supermarket, shoving cans of ravioli into my duffel, Mr. B winding around my feet. Suddenly he stopped and hissed, staring at something behind me. Instantly tensing up, I kept one hand on the duffel and reached my other to the knife at my hip before spinning around. What did I find, you ask? Well, the table that had been sitting behind me empty this whole time now wasn't. Empty, I mean. It was like one of those display tables that sits near the checkout, showing an item on a particular sale. Or maybe one of those tables that sits in the bakery section and bears all kinds of cookies and pies. Only it had been completely bare and dusty when I walked in. And now it wasn't. Now it was laid out neatly with plates and bowls of food. I saw mashed potatoes, steak, fried chicken, brownies. My mouth watered as my gaze fell on the most tempting of all. A plate of what appeared to be lasagna. Or more specifically, my mom's lasagna. Trust me, I could just tell. I couldn't help it. The food drew me in. Honestly, I think it's enchanted somehow. Even though I knew better, I took several steps toward the table, practically drooling. Mr. Bailey meowed loudly at my feet, but I barely heard him. I stopped next to the table and began to reach out for the plate of lasagna. It had been so long since I had anything cooked by my mom. How could I waste it? Luckily, 2 things happened at the same time. My other hand slipped, and I dropped the knife, slicing my finger in the process. And Mr. Bailey yowled and clawed at my ankles, cutting them up pretty impressively. The pain from both these things snapped me out of it. I cursed and instantly stepped back, picking up the knife as I did. Almost had me there. Nice try, motherfucker, I said, chuckling into the darkness. I swear I heard a growl from the shadows near the deli. That meant it was time to get going. If an Ashley was here, the rest of the hated high school gang couldn't be far behind. My duffel was mostly full anyway. Come on, Mr. B, I said, and he immediately jumped up onto his usual perch on my shoulder. Only that wasn't the end of it. Ashleys have had to evolve, you see. As people got scarcer and learned to be wary of magical tables of food, they had to figure out new ways to ensnare us. And that's why I encountered an old woman as I exited the store. She was hunched over, with a hood over her face. A telltale sign that this wasn't a human, because what human being with a functioning brain do you know would try to look less suspicious by completely obscuring her face with a hood? You look hungry, she whispered, with a voice like nails on a chalkboard. She extended a wrinkly hand, and it was an apple. Which, I have to be honest, was not tempting because of whatever magic was involved, but because I hadn't seen fresh fruit in months. Here, for you. This time I was ready, though. I actually laughed out loud. Really? The Snow White act? Down to the apple and witch disguise and all? You're better than this. I don't know what you're talking about, growled the Ashley. Trust me, it's a good reference, I said. Then I pushed back the hood. She slithered back with a screech. It was nothing I wasn't expecting. The usual purple eyes, nearly transparent skin, no hair or eyebrows, just inked on red swirls instead. Was it supposed to fool anyone? Was it supposed to look like hair? Or did they just have weird taste in tattoos? Can't say. I held my knife up to its throat. Despite calling them Ashleys, I have no idea what gender it was, because as far as I can tell, they don't have distinct genders. They all look exactly the same, At least the ones I've encountered. I know you can't do anything to me unless I accept that apple, so nice try again. 0 for 2. Hell of a record. I'm not going to accept it, so you best get out of here before I sick my cat on you. Mr. Bailey meowed happily as if to reinforce my point. God, that cat's a genius. He actually growled at me, and a second later had vanished. I went merrily on my way, made it home, and heated up ravioli from a can for dinner. But the whole thing got me thinking about rule number 6, which is what saved my life. And that got me thinking about the reason behind rule number 6, and why I even know how to stay safe from Ashley's in the first place. So let me take you back to an instance of horror, one that happened about a month after this all started, when I saw firsthand what happens if you fall for an Ashley's trap. Rule number 6. Don't eat food that you didn't prepare, or steal, yourself, especially if nicely plated on a table. Addition. Or if offered by someone wearing a dark hood like a creep. The addition became necessary when I realized that the Ashleys were expanding their tactics to include personal offerings. This didn't happen until their tables started working less. Now I swear one of them tries to hand me something every time a table doesn't work. Although that's getting less effective too, so I can't wait to see what they try next. Stay tuned! About a month after everything started, I broke into a house to steal food, which is not as illegal as it sounds, since the house and food were both long since unused. The messes of what had once been the owners' bodies were splattered in their living room, and the smell was horrific. Gagging slightly, I made my way to the kitchen. Only, it turned out someone else apparently had the same idea, because when I entered the kitchen, there was a guy standing at the pantry, loading up a backpack. I cleared my throat loudly and said, "Hey buddy, mind sharing?" He jumped a mile and spun around with a gun in hand, but relaxed once he caught sight of me. He stepped back and gestured for me to step up to the pantry. "Help yourself," he said. "There's more than enough for 2. "Much appreciated," I said, pretending to tip my hat. "It's nice to see someone else, especially when they're not getting torn apart," he said from behind me, as I wasted no time dumping food into my duffel. They had unopened Oreos, and they wouldn't be stale yet. It hadn't been that long. I'd be feasting later. I nodded absent-mindedly, but a second later felt his hand on my sleeve. Okay, touching was still a no. We weren't friends on a level that warranted physical contact just because he let me steal from the same pantry. I looked up to tell him just that, but he was staring behind us, starry-eyed. "Look," he whispered. So I turned and followed his gaze. My mouth dropped open too when I saw what he had. The kitchen table had suddenly, inexplicably, filled with plates of beautiful, fresh food. Meats and pastas and side dishes, fruits and desserts. It was the kind of spread you'd see during a holiday at your grandma's house. I felt drawn to it, and I really wanted to eat it. I did. But Mr. Bailey growling and digging his claws into my shoulder made me think better of it. I think the pain kept my brain sharp, looking back. Pain seems to be the best way to snap out of the trance the food causes. But also, the food had just appeared. It definitely hadn't been there when I'd entered. I may be an idiot, but I'd noticed that. And food just showing up when our backs was turned didn't seem like a good sign. I hadn't encountered an Ashley yet at this point, but I figured something non-human had originated this, and based on my experiences so far, I wasn't going to place any bets on it being friendly. The guy was already walking towards it, dangerously close to the table. "Don't," I said. He didn't listen. I'm not sure he heard me. Look, I'm not proud of myself, but I shrugged and turned back to the pantry, muttering, "It's your funeral." In my defense, I didn't know him, and he looked kind of like Caleb, the original one. Fuck Caleb. But then Mr. Bailey meowed in protest and leapt from my shoulder, and there was also a weird purple flash of light from behind me, so I couldn't leave him to his fate anymore. I dropped the duffel and spun around again, knife in hand, expecting to be face to face with some kind of monster. Only, I didn't see anything. Just a lot of shadows, and this guy sitting at the table, shoveling macaroni and cheese into his mouth like there was no tomorrow. Cautiously, I stepped closer to him and came around so that I was facing him. That's when it got weird. He was staring straight ahead, not even looking at the food, and his eyes had gone entirely purple. When I say entirely, I mean entirely. No pupils, no irises, just straight up purple. His skin was changing too, even as I watched. Becoming paler? No, that wasn't right. It was becoming more see-through, more and more resembling a piece of tissue paper. I had no idea what was happening, but holy shit, it sure didn't seem good. I yelled at him, but he kept on eating as if I wasn't there. When he finished the mac and cheese, he immediately reached for a plate of ribs and took one. Desperate, I quickly reached out and grabbed his hand, enclosing my own around his and the rib in it. And suddenly, I wasn't in the kitchen anymore. Or, I kind of was, only it was different now. Full of light, a vase of flowers on the counter, decorations on the yellow walls. The walls definitely hadn't been yellow earlier. As I brought my gaze down from the walls to the table, I yelped in shock, because now there were people here. What the hell? This guy whose hand I was still holding sat beside me. Across the table were 2 young girls, both with blonde braids, and to our left was a woman who resembled them so much she had to be their mother. All of them were smiling, laughing, and sharing the food spread out before us, which, oddly enough, was the only thing that hadn't changed. In this alternate version of the kitchen, the man finally seemed to realize I was there. He turned to look up at me, tears sparkling in his god-awful purple eyes and running down his cheeks. "My family," he said. "My wife and daughters. They've come back to me." I really had no idea if this was a shared hallucination or something, but before I could think of a response, I froze dead in my tracks, my heart nearly stopping. Because behind the man, coming towards us, since I was still grasping his hand like we were lovers in the nighttime, I'd seen a monster. It had the same purple eyes and translucent skin that the man now sported, and its head and arms were covered in what appeared to be swirling red tattoos. It smiled at me as it came closer, and flitted out its tongue, which was forked. Hell no. I'd been successfully avoiding monsters for a month. I wasn't dying at the hand of this tattooed fucker with my hand glued to a stranger. "Come on," I said, looking down at the man. "It's fake. Whatever monster this is, it's using the food to make a hallucination. It must be the food. Put it down, for God's sake." He shook his head, completely unconcerned with what I just told him, and turned back to his family. The imaginary version of his wife smiled at him and reached over, touching the hand that I hadn't already claimed. "This must be heaven," he whispered. "I can stay here forever." "Well, you can stay here until you die, but I sure as hell won't," I said. "I tried. See ya, pal." I'd been hoping to make a dramatic exit after that, but my hand was stuck. I pulled and made no progress as the monster closed the distance. It was like the rib was gluing us together. The monster had put its transparent hand on the man's shoulder and was bending towards his face, smiling at me, when I finally yanked hard enough to free myself and went tumbling backwards. The false kitchen dissolved around me as soon as I lost physical contact with the rib. I was plunged back into the shadowy reality, Mr. Bailey rubbing on my legs and purring like he'd expected to never have me back. I didn't know what to expect now that I was back in the real version of the world, and not the man's fantasy. But the monster was still here. I was already deciding to call it Ashley, since its red swirls bore a vague resemblance to a girl with red hair named Ashley, who, you guessed it, I hated in high school. It was also, I think, sucking out the man's soul. I could only watch as it jerked his head back, brought its mouth about 6 inches from his, and stuck its forked tongue down his throat. He thrashed and moaned, but the look of bliss and ignorance never left his face, and he never let go of the rib. Only seconds later, the tongue reemerged, with a scoop of blindingly white substance on its tip. The monster swallowed it, smiled, and went back for more. Each time the man thrashed and shrieked in pain, but made no move to protest. I was too shocked to do anything, and it was all over within a minute or so anyway. The man got more and more shriveled with each bite of soul the monster took, and before I knew it, he fell down to the table, a shriveled husk of skin. He looked more like a deflated balloon than a human corpse. And here's the worst part. His face was still blissful, and his hand still gripped that fucking rib. I expected the Ashley to come for me next, but it didn't. It looked at me with those terrible purple eyes and said, "That wasn't your food. Next time, perhaps." And then it was gone, fading back into the shadows like it was never there, leaving me sitting on the kitchen floor, heart pounding, next to a shell of a man and a table that was empty once more. Rule number 6. Don't eat food that you didn't prepare or steal yourself, especially if nicely plated on a table. Addition, or if offered by someone wearing a dark hood like a creep. Not unless you want to sit happily in a fantasy world of your own making while an Ashley devours your soul. You won't even know what's happening, and no one can save you. After all, it's your food, and it's your dream. They're only using it against you.